They are destroying the enemy and increasing the exchange fund. Ukraine's defense forces continue to hold back the occupiers' advance in the Pokrovsk direction. Good morning. Today, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, Oleksandr Syrskyi, visited this section of the front. He stated that in just the past 4 days, 350 Russian soldiers were eliminated in the Pokrovsk sector of the front. The exchange fund is also being replenished. Ukrainian paratroopers note that small arms battles are intensifying in the city.
There have been reports of Russians appearing north of Pokrovsk. Several infantrymen tried to infiltrate and gain a foothold at one of the agricultural facilities. The enemy was completely destroyed. The girls are now taking a well-deserved rest because they are currently unable to break through the strong and heavily fortified defenses of Pokrovsk, and since they can't use the city as a strategic foothold for their operations, the Russians are now trying to come up with a new plan. Bypass the city. From a statement by the 7th Air Assault Corps of the Ukrainian Armed Forces on Telegram.
At the same time, Russian troops continue their unsuccessful attempts to break through the defenses of Mirnograd, analysts say. There, Ukrainian soldiers destroyed a group from the main intelligence directorate of the Russian General Staff. Experts explain that the Pokrovsk-Mirnograd flank is a potential route for entering the rear of Ukrainian defenses in the tactical area of Kostiantynivka, as well as for further advances that Gerasimov has repeatedly announced to Putin. And now, analysts note he won't spare either people or equipment to fulfill his promises.
This is also precisely why the enemy is currently stepping up and intensifying its actions and operations on the Kostiantynivka front, taking more aggressive measures, and as a result, the Russians are actively operating on the Lyman direction, still hoping that they can succeed. I think they believe they can cut off the Kostiantynivka-Zaporizhzhia group, our forces, and then they'll need reinforcements from the north, from the Lyman direction, to advance on Lyman. I don't think the Russian occupiers will be able to pull off this plan.
Since the beginning of the day, the Russian army has stormed the positions of Ukraine's defense forces 140 times along the entire front line, according to the calculations of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. On the Kostiantynivka direction, 19 attacks were repelled. The Russians made another 15 attempts to break through Ukrainian defenses on the Lyman section of the front. On the Oleksandrivka bridgehead, Russian troops tried about 10 times to push Ukrainian soldiers from their positions. And on the Vovshak's direction, the Russians have changed their tactics, according to Ukrainian soldiers. Because of the weather and impassable roads, the enemy abandoned the use of vehicles in frontal assaults. Instead, they're trying several times a day with small infantry groups to probe for a gap in the Ukrainian defenses. And on the Huliaipole section of the front, Ukrainian forces stopped 4 attacks by the invaders near 3 settlements. Some experts explain the slowdown in the advance of Russian troops by saying that the fighting in Pokrovsk has drawn in large enemy forces and prevents Russian generals from maneuvering their reserves.
We're talking about the fact that, according to some estimates, the same 5th Combined Arms Army of the Russian Federation has lost the equivalent of 1.5 or even 2 full Russian divisions. These are big numbers. That's why the advance on Huliaipole is also slowing down today. It's not because the Russians have changed their plans. No, they clearly have a plan to try to keep up the momentum they tactically gained on the battlefield.
Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, Russian army combat losses have exceeded 1,162,000 personnel. Just in the past 24 hours, the defense forces managed to eliminate 890 Russian occupiers, according to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. In addition, Ukrainian defenders destroyed a tank, 2 armored vehicles, and nearly 24 of the occupiers' artillery systems. Ukrainian armed forces soldiers also managed to shoot down almost 400 Russian drones and more than 40 cruise missiles. Nearly 70 vehicles and fuel tankers have been put out of commission.
More details on the situation at the front. Over the past day, there were 193 combat engagements. According to the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, the situation remains tense in the Pokrovsk direction. There, the defense forces repelled more than 50 attacks by Russian Federation troops. Ukrainian soldiers also stopped 25 Russian assaults in the Kostiantynivka direction. And in the Lyman sector, Ukrainian defenders managed to repel 15 attempts by the Russian army to break through the defenses.
And we'll discuss this topic in more detail with Ihor Romanenko. He is the founder of the charitable foundation We Will Close the Sky of Ukraine and a lieutenant general. Hello, thank you for joining us.
Hello.
Hello there, how are you?
Well, let's talk in more detail about the situation at the front right now, and then we'll move on to more military political questions. Here's the next point I'm interested in. The deadline for Pokrovsk has been missed. Another one. I've already lost count of which one it is. But why am I focusing on this particular deadline? First of all, because Putin publicly announced it, and President Zelensky confirmed it, saying, yes, Putin gave this task to his military. The occupied Pokrovsk by mid-November. Now we're already approaching the end of November, but Pokrovsk hasn't been captured. Moreover, the Russians are suffering heavy losses, and there's no disruption of logistics. What could the Russian occupiers do next?
Maybe it's also worth reminding that all this started in even harsher tones, connected to the fact that our troop groups were said to be surrounded directly in the Pokrovsk-Mirnograd agglomeration, surrounded, I emphasize, as well as in Kupiansk. Although neither of these claims was true, and the fighting continues. While moving deadlines around isn't really our concern, we're simply saying that they're big talkers, and that means their plans aren't coming to fruition. At least not the way their propaganda presents it. Although the situation in both places is quite difficult, both in Pokrovsk and in Kupiansk, the most difficult situation, without a doubt, is around the Pokrovsk-Mirnograd agglomeration. And here, on the part of the defense forces, the fighting is specifically about maintaining the logistical routes, which are connected to... Currently, Ukrainian forces are holding Rodinske, and there's ongoing fighting for control over the area of Krasny Lyman, which the enemy supposedly does not fully control. And in this particular area, the necessary and essential supplies are delivered directly and efficiently to the brave defenders of Pokrovsk, and then further on to the city of Mirnograd. And here, it should definitely be said that Mirnograd is also supplied through Pokrovsk, and this is not an easy approach, and a real test for the defenders who are in Mirnograd. Because fighting is already taking place in Mirnograd from the east, the enemy is advancing from Novoekonomichne in the south, but one way or another, as long as there is at least some steady logistical support, the fighting will continue. And there is a lot of talk about the decision, when and whether to withdraw troops from this defensive area and position. Here, of course, the main role and responsibility in assessing the situation lies with the commanders, not at the tactical level, but the final decision will, of course, be made by those of higher rank. The higher-ups. As for Kupiansk, the fighting there is not just about Kupiansk itself, but also about the group of troops located east of the river. The enemy understands this, and that's why they are attacking in the area of Pishana nearby in order to split up this group. And again, logistical support there relies on crossings, and the bridges in Kupiansk itself play a role in this. In Kupiansk itself, the enemy still holds the northern part of the city, and fighting continues. With varying success, the fighting is happening street by street in the center. The situation here is better than, say, in Pokrovsk or Mirnograd, but it remains tense. And to say that things have stabilized here, well, at best, it's on the way to stabilization, but it's definitely too early to make a clear assessment of the situation there. In addition, the enemy is attacking on... The defensive line runs through Kostiantynivka, Druzhkova, Kramatorsk, and Slavyansk directly. On the map, if you look, that's Kostiantynivka. Fighting is already happening on the outskirts. Attacks are continuing from 3 sides for several more hours. And despite the bandit claims that it has been captured, our defensive resistance continues there. And of course, this is also connected to the situation in Kostiantynivka. So in order to attack Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, the enemy is making efforts to attack from the northeast, that is, from Lyman towards Siversk. And there, they have shown some increased activity, and there is some advancement. But overall, the situation is stabilized. Still, the situation in Zaporizhzhia around Huliaipole has at least seen movement come to a halt. and in Dnipropetrovsk region as well. Appropriate actions are being taken by the leadership at the tactical level, not only by Ukraine's defense forces. And there, both in Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia, the conditions for conducting combat operations are different. That is, if we take Donetsk region, there are quite a lot of settlements, elevations, and so on, around which defensive lines and areas can be organized. So here, things look much more complicated. It's necessary to dig in, to carry out forced engineering work during combat operations. This is very difficult to do. Tasks are being carried out under such conditions.
Igor Alexandrovich, regarding other directions, are there similar, perhaps deadlines, if not Pokrovsk? As for the Russians, we see that in Zaporizhzhia as well, active fighting hasn't stopped. And now the enemy is trying to cut Ukrainian troops off from logistics. What is the situation there?
We know that over the past week, the enemy managed to advance toward Huliaipole. The distance between the forward detachments or groups and the city of Huliaipole was gradually reduced over time. This movement occurred from the north as well as from the northeast as the forces continued their approach. But given that reserves and resources were found within Ukraine's defense forces, these kinds of actions have been halted. But their actions continue, with attempts to attack on the western part of the contact line and ongoing fighting in the Zaporizhzhia region. This is in the area west of Orikhiv, and there are also ongoing battles around there, near Stepnohirsk and further north near Primorsk and Kamyanske. Along this line, the enemy is trying to advance. They are trying to establish positions that would allow them to operate. While over there, let's say the distance or the gap to Zaporizhzhia from this western side is about 25 kilometers. And so the efforts are aimed at advancing even further, with a continued commitment to progress and the pursuit of new achievements, while at the same time giving the enemy forces the ability to strike, to respond in their own way, and to add their own actions and influence to the ongoing situation as it develops. But our defenders are disrupting these plans in this direction, separating them, and so on.
Igor Alexandrovich, and now let's smoothly transition to a military political question. Right now, there is a lot of news coming out that the United States of America is doing everything possible to put pressure on Putin. There is also talk about possible points, with reports saying that Trump has approved the 28th point and a peace plan between Russia and Ukraine. So far, the details of this plan have not been disclosed, but high-ranking officials are talking about possible territorial concessions, but I'm talking about a ceasefire along the line of contact. Let's think about this from a strategic point of view. How dangerous could it be if the Russian Federation uses the pause to build up its forces and possibly launch further strikes, including against European Union countries? After all, we see that right now all of Russia's mobilization resources are directed against Ukraine. But does stopping hostilities in this way actually increase the danger? And do you think this poses a direct risk of escalation for other countries? This is an exclusively strategic question, without any hidden agenda. Strategically speaking,
In my opinion, it should first and foremost be considered in relation to Ukraine itself. If we need to move towards suspending hostilities and transitioning to a ceasefire, maybe nothing more than that. We cannot find a peace agreement with them. I always remind people of the situation with Japan. There are fundamental issues regarding the suspension of hostilities. Maybe gradually in the areas that Ukraine has proposed, starting with airspace, at sea, and then moving further, we could in principle address this issue. As for a ceasefire, well, I have a certain skepticism, since Vitka, a so-called great strategist and expert on both Ukraine and military affairs and security, was working on it. He probably gained that experience through his activities in construction companies and all that. So, well, and with the representative from Russia, who obviously on a number of sections, points 28 or so, or important sections, are being written down, including Ukraine's security. But underneath that, the main provisions are being introduced, the ultimatum demands that were made in 2022. And they are trying to maintain and impose them now. So I see it as the Americans, thanks to the actions of the Russians, are going through a new cycle. And peacekeeping efforts basically come down to not fundamentally touching Russia. For example, if sanctions were imposed on 2 companies, then Putin's Lukoil later had those measures eased. And that's why the cycle repeats and new pressure is put on Ukraine to give up, first of all. All the positions we still hold in Donetsk, we are defending. The essence is the same as always. The church and a group of churchmen, Russian KGB agents, are now in America. They'll leave the Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, the language, and all the other supporting issues, but they never forget about them. But mainly, it looks like this. Just like that.
Agents of influence are never gotten rid of. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us. Let me remind our viewers. Ihor Romanenko, founder of the Close the Sky Over Ukraine Charitable Foundation and Lieutenant General, was with us today.
Subscribe to The Gaze and stay updated on the most important events, top news from Ukraine and all over the world, in-depth analysis, exclusive reports and interviews, all on hand in our channel. Join our community of viewers and stay tuned.